Welcome to the first Red Nosed Research and Education meeting. This will be the first in a bi-monthly series highlighting the research funded by Red Nose, the various education and programs run by Red Nose and its partners, health professionals, and the broader community. We'd like to start by an acknowledgement of country.
Red Nose Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land on which our staff, volunteers, board and committee members work, live and visit.
We pay our respects to elders past and present, recognising their continual connection to land, waters and community. We acknowledge our strength and wisdom as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We honour our families and our practices that have kept us safe for many years.
Red Nose appreciates the sharing of knowledge and expertise of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples with their strong culture and traditions. Red Nose recognises the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' experience of loss in many forms. Together we grieve the loss of our babies across this beautiful wide land.
Red Nose acknowledges our little bubbies that have passed away and acknowledges all those families that it has touched in their sorry visits. We remember our star babies.
Tonight we have three speakers, which I'll now introduce. The first speaker is Distinguished Laureate Professor Roger Smith, who will be presenting Understanding Placental Aging. Professor Smith has over 30 years of exceptional scientific leadership and skills in reproduction, as evidenced by his Distinguished Scientist Award from the Society for Reproductive Investigation in Paris in March 2019. Professor Smith is the first person from the Southern Hemisphere to be recognised by this award. He's previously received the Australasian Medal of the British Endocrine Society and the University of Siena Prize for Interdisciplinary Research, a fellowship of the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Obstetrics and Gynecology and the Society of Reproductive Biology. He's also received an Order of Australia for his contributions to women's health and Indigenous health. In July 2019, Professor Smith was invited to present the Sharpie-Schaefer Prize lecture at Physiology in Aberdeen. He's been working on placental aging for a number of years now, and we look forward to his presentation about understanding placental aging. The second person that I'd like to introduce tonight is Keren Ludski, who's going to present on grief and loss. She's the Red Nose CEO. Her presentation will cover how to support families through perinatal loss, neonatal loss, and miscarriage. Keren is a value-driven leader with a passion for empowering and working with individuals and organisations. She focuses on making sure every family in Australia receives the education they need to keep their babies safe, and that any family that needs it receives appropriate bereavement support and care. Keren believes in empowering community through two-way engagement, education and support. She leads with passion, delivering purposeful projects that deliver positive change and leaves a lasting impact in the community. As an experienced and passionate clinician, Keren has a deep understanding of the psychological distress of grief and trauma. She advocates for systematic organisational and societal change to ensure improvements in the support for bereaved parents. Keren is also a bereaved parent of Ben, who tragically died from SIDS in 1998. This lived experience helps drive her passion and dedication for Red Nose. Family stories are an important part of the history of Red Nose. At all board meetings and staff meetings, family impact stories are shared to highlight the important work that Red Nose carries out in the community. So we never forget these families. They are families, they're not statistics. Tonight we have Carla, who's going to present her story about her and baby Apollo.
So in late May of 2019, I found out via a blood test that I was unknowingly pregnant. And based on blood work, my GP advised that I was roughly between 6 to 8 weeks and suggested I make my way to the ED urgently as my blood pressure was extremely high. After several hours of monitoring my type 1 diabetes and my physical condition, I was diagnosed with preeclampsia. As the day progressed, my first bedside scan revealed I was around 14 weeks pregnant while my second bedside scan indicated I was actually about 22 weeks pregnant. The following morning, we had our first ultrasound to establish the health, gestation, and gender of our baby. We were told that the baby was approximately 23 weeks. The gender could not be determined at that time. All organs were properly formed and there was a strong heartbeat, but our baby was considerably small, weighing over only 430 grams. So due to my preeclampsia and a poorly functioning placenta, doctors were concerned that it was going to be a considerably dangerous pregnancy for both baby and I, but there wasn't any urgent need to deliver. As days passed, both mine and baby's condition had changed and worsened in some ways. I decided to have steroid injections to help baby's lung function improve, which meant that due to my diabetes, my blood sugars were monitored every single hour for 2 days. My husband and I jointly made the decision to opt for a cesarean so that the baby was no longer struggling in my womb due to lack of nutrients. And this would be performed once I reached 24 weeks and was classified as a viable pregnancy. On Thursday, the 6th of June, which was actually the morning of my scheduled cesarean, the obstetrician came in to prepare me, check the baby's heartbeat once more. And that's when I heard the words that no expectant parent ever wants to hear, that, unfortunately, the baby no longer had a heartbeat. And by that stage, we'd actually made it to 24 weeks, and one day that bub didn't survive. The following morning, the 7th of June, I was moved to the delivery suite and I was given tablets to help with natural delivery. Around 8 p.m. on the 8th of June, my contractions started and labour lasted for about 5 hours. At 12:48 a.m. on Sunday, the 9th of June, my beautiful boy entered the world sleeping. He weighed 500 grams, but he was so delicate that he had to be placed on a pillow so he could be close to me. We named him Apollo Christian Eid and sometimes refer to him as Ace. So we were given the opportunity to see him for a few days after that and spend time with him, thanks to the hospital's cold crib. But the night that I left the hospital after a 2-week ordeal without any baby was by far the worst night of my life. I think that's because when the reality of the whole situation finally sank in. So we had his funeral the following week, and I then decided to share our story on social media as just one way of healing. I found journaling and scrapbooking helped. So did being out in nature, visiting the cemetery, and also reading out to organisations like Red Nose. So over the last almost 5 years, I have received newsletters from Red Nose with information relating to the ways in which they support bereaved parents like my husband and I. I've received information regarding safe sleep and reducing the risk of SIDS, which provided me with so much reassurance when we welcomed our rainbow baby Dion last March. I appreciate that I am given an opportunity to acknowledge Apollo at certain times of year when Red Nose create memorial walls, remembrance tiles, events, or social media posts that allow me to share my firstborn's name with the world and keep his memory alive. Actually, on the 25th of March this year, I attended a Say Their Name remembrance service hosted by Red Nose, and I started speaking to another bereaved parent who I've stayed in touch with since, and I'm having lunch with her on Sunday. So for me, Red Nose has definitely created a sense of community among others who can understand my loss and grief. It's introduced me to a world where I know I'm not alone. And every chance that Red Nose offered me to mention my son Apollo, including sharing our story tonight, allows me to feel that little bit closer and connected to him, which I think can often be hard to come by when you have a child in heaven. And yeah, that's all I'd like to say about that.
Thank you, Carla, for sharing your story. We really appreciate it and understand how difficult that must have been. Now we're going to hear from Professor Roger Smith, and after that we would like to ask you some questions, Carla, and also Roger. So I'll hand over to you now, Roger.
Good evening, everybody. Unfortunately, Carla's story is all too common, and our unit has been trying to understand why these devastating events occur. We've made substantial advances in understanding what causes quite a number of stillbirths, and to try and effectively communicate that knowledge, we've created a video for bereaved families. Understanding stillbirth. Stillbirth is the death of the baby after 20 weeks of pregnancy. It is common, affecting 1 in every 150 pregnancies. Families affected by stillbirth are left with long-lasting sadness and often depression. Many mothers blame themselves. Recent research in Newcastle, Australia, reveals that in many cases, the cause lies not in the mother, but in the placenta, an organ of the baby. The placenta is created as part of the pregnancy. It is responsible for the transport of oxygen and nutrients to the growing baby and waste products from the baby to the mother. The placenta consists of many lobules containing tree-like structures called villi. The villi are the site of oxygen and nutrient exchange. The mother's blood enters the placenta by specially modified arteries and gently circulates around the villi. The branches of the villi bathe in the nutrient-rich blood. The mother's blood then leaves the placenta, carrying away carbon dioxide and other waste products. The mother's blood and the blood of the baby never mix. Separating the two is a single giant cell that covers the entire inner surface of the placenta, including the villi. The single giant cell is called the syncytial trophoblast. The syncytial trophoblast, covering the surface of the villi, transports the nutrients and oxygen from the mother's red blood cells to the red blood cells of the baby. Within the syncytial trophoblast are organelles called mitochondria. The mitochondria use oxygen to convert the sugar contained in nutrients into energy. This stored energy supports the functions of the placenta. The cell also has a recycling system called autophagy, which is key to keeping the placenta functioning efficiently. As part of the syncytial trophoblast recycling system, autophagosomes swallow abnormal proteins and aging cell components, such as mitochondria, and they then combine with acid-filled structures called lysosomes, which break down the proteins into materials the cell can reuse for energy and cell maintenance. With these and other cellular mechanisms working efficiently, the placenta can meet the increasing needs of the baby, resulting in the development and delivery of a healthy baby. Unfortunately, not all placentas remain healthy. In some cases, the placenta starts to age before the birth of the baby. This process begins in the syncytial trophoblast with deterioration in the function of the mitochondria. As the mitochondria age, they release dangerous molecules called free radicals. These free radicals can cause damage to all the structures within the syncytial trophoblast and produce aging in the placenta. The more the placenta ages, the more free radicals are produced. These aging-related effects prevent lysosomes from binding to autophagosomes. As a result, the defective contents cannot be broken down, causing the autophagosomes to enlarge and fill the syncytial trophoblast, reducing its function. This cellular damage can cause blockages in the maternal arteries. This causes a decrease in blood supply and an increase in the velocity of blood entering the space between the villi. This damages the placental tissue, reducing the amount of oxygen available for the mitochondria to create energy and to meet the needs of the growing baby. Together, these aging-related changes in the placenta lead to the sudden death of the baby. To prevent this devastating outcome, scientists in the Newcastle Centre are developing blood tests to identify the presence of an aging placenta, indicating the pregnancy is at risk of stillbirth. This will allow for treatment to slow the aging process or delivery before the death of the baby. So in the future, more babies will be born well-grown and healthy. So I hope that video gave people some insights into the understanding of the processes that sometimes lead to stillbirth that our laboratory has helped to elucidate or determine. The major reason we produced this video was because we understood that many women who've experienced a stillbirth blame themselves, and that can lead to depression and great sadness and guilt that exacerbates the natural distress from having a stillbirth. And we wanted to make it clear that for many cases, the problem is in the placenta, an organ of the baby, not of the mother. And so the mother is not responsible for the unfortunate outcome. It's a problem within the baby itself, not the mother. So we thought that message was very important to communicate with the mums and the families who've experienced a stillbirth.
Thank you, Roger, for the amazing video that you and your team have generated. I wondered if it would be okay if we started by asking you a question, Carla. So as a bereaved parent, how does hearing about this research impact on your thoughts and feelings about your loss?
Yeah, so listening to that was actually quite interesting because it spoke about things in a more technical way, I suppose, like what's actually happening medically to my body and that process that I endured. So, you know, I mean, to me, with the loss that I went through, I wasn't thinking of any of that. But I think that what Roger just said about, you know, taking away the guilt from the mother, that's what really sticks with me. Because that was the biggest thing. I was blaming myself after our stillbirth, especially when the doctors found the cause of death being related to placental abruption. So that was a very big burden that I was carrying because I thought I'd failed my baby. But yeah, just watching that and hearing what Roger said really for me has kind of solidified the healing I did to let go of that guilt that I was carrying.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So, based on the work that you and your team are doing, Roger, how would you see the next steps in developing a new prediction tool occurring?
So there are two things that follow from this work. The first, as Craig, you've just suggested, is the opportunity to perhaps predict stillbirth more effectively. And the second is perhaps to even be able to treat the aging-related pathways and reduce or slow the aging of the placenta so that the stillbirth doesn't occur. As far as developing a diagnostic test, the placental tissue actually releases tiny parts of itself into the mother's blood circulation. And what we're doing is developing ways of picking up those tiny pieces of placenta in the mother's blood, which we can then interrogate or study to find out whether the placenta that the piece came from is aging faster than it should be or not. And that will guide us in identifying the baby that's at risk of stillbirth.
And would you anticipate that this test would be available to everyone, or just people with growth restriction or women with preeclampsia?
So at the moment, I'm afraid we haven't got the test yet. So that's what our team are researching at the moment. When we have developed the right way of testing these particles released from the placenta into the mother's blood, we will then need to do studies on large numbers of women to find out which groups of women the test works best in. And that's actually when, Craig, your cohort, the new 1000, will become very valuable. Not everybody may be aware of it, but Professor Pennell is running a large recruitment program called New 1000, which collects blood samples from 1,000 mums as they go through pregnancy and follows them all the way through the pregnancy and then follows the babies afterwards. So we would be able to take samples from that study, do our testing, and know then how effective the testing was at picking up babies at risk of stillbirth. It could be that we could study everybody and the test would work well, or perhaps the test would need to be restricted just to those babies showing signs of being smaller than they should be, a little bit like Carla's baby, and just restrict our testing to that group. We don't know the answer to those questions yet. That's the research we're working on now.
So there's a question from online, and the question relates to assessing the placenta during pregnancy. How would you see placental assessment and the blood test, the biomarker, working together?
So there are increasing techniques for looking at the placenta, for instance, with MRI scans and ultrasounds. But as I've already mentioned, the placenta does release tiny parts of itself into the mother's blood. They're called exosomes. And we've already been able to purify the exosomes from the mother's blood in our laboratory and begun to study their contents. And there's samples of the placenta released all the time. So this is quite a special opportunity to get a biological sample of the placenta during the pregnancy while the baby's alive, while the placenta's working. It's quite an extraordinary advance to understand that we can get samples from the placenta while the woman's still pregnant, and those samples reflect what's going on in her particular placenta. So we're hoping that this will lead to a lot of advances in our ability to care for pregnant women.
So another question from our audience. You very clearly explained how the placenta ages. Why doesn't the baby or the fetus age? The fetus grows and develops, but the placenta ages, which are kind of opposing effects. Wondering if you could expand on that a bit further.
Yes, it is fascinating, isn't it? So the placenta and the baby both come from fertilization of the egg by the sperm. But very early in the development, the part that's going to become the placenta follows a different pathway to the part that's going to become the baby. And the placenta only is required to live for 9 months, while the baby might live for 90 years. So Mother Nature is not wasteful, unfortunately. She's quite a tough mum. And therefore, the placenta is only designed to live about 9 months, not the 90 years that the baby might live. And in some pregnancies, the placenta is aging significantly before the baby is born. And that's what leads to the stillbirth. So I'm not sure that I can explain it more than that, except to say that these two parts of the conceptus, the placenta and the baby, are on, if you like, different time zones, running different clocks. One clock runs faster than the other. And that's what leads sometimes to the death of the baby.
So another question from the audience relates to placental calcification. So as pregnancy advances, some women get increasing amounts of calcification in the placenta. How does that relate to the placental aging that you're talking about?
Yes, so calcification is often a sign of aging. Unfortunately, I've seen some x-rays of myself, and some of my arteries are starting to calcify as I get older. So yes, it is a sign of aging. It's only one sign of aging, and just by itself doesn't mean, fortunately for me, that all my tissues are no longer working. But it is a sign of aging. And we age at different rates. I'm sure everybody's noticed amongst their friends, their parents, their grandparents, that some age more rapidly than others. Seen pictures of people over 100 skydiving or doing running races, and other people in their 50s and 60s can't do it. It's the same with the placenta. It ages at different rates. And of course, one of the issues is deciding when a baby should be born. Ideally, the baby should continue inside the uterus as long as the placenta is healthy, because the longer it stays in the uterus, the better the development of the baby, including the baby's brain. So it's a challenging decision to make when to deliver the baby. And I'm lucky I don't have to make that decision. That's a decision that obstetricians like Professor Pennell have to make in consultation with the mother and the family. And every pregnancy is different, just the same as every individual is different. And the trade-offs between being born a bit later or being born a bit earlier are complex trade-offs. And hopefully in the future, the development of the tests that we're doing at the moment to monitor the placenta will make it easier for mums and obstetricians and dads to think about this and make better decisions for the baby's future health.
So I have one question which I'm going to answer because I can. And one of the attendees basically asked, I got to 40 weeks and my baby passed away and I was told my placenta is fine. And I guess the response to that question is that there are many different causes of stillbirth, and a large number of them relate to placental dysfunction and placental aging, but not all stillbirths. There are stillbirths caused by other things. And the research that Professor Smith is working on is that broad group of placental disorders which have accelerated aging. So that
could I add, though, when people say the placenta is fine, how did they decide it was fine? Sometimes, for instance, adults can come into the hospital with a heart attack. They looked fine until they had the heart attack. And the placenta, although it may appear to be normal, if you study it at the biochemical level in the way that we've described, it might not be as normal as the ordinary assessment rates it. So I'm not saying it was not normal, but I am saying that the standard ways of assessing the pathology of the placenta won't be looking at the detailed measures that we've been doing in the laboratory to identify the aging pathways. It's just not possible for routine pathology to do the type of tests that we do at this stage. So there are two answers to the question. One is, as Craig said, not every stillbirth is related to aging of the placenta. But the other answer is also that picking up the biochemical changes of aging in the sort of things that I covered in the video, for instance, the autophagosomes, they're not looked at as part of the usual histopathological examination of the placenta.
And the last question, well, no, I have two more. The age, what do you feel is the relationship between placental aging and placental abruption?
I've thought a bit about this. I think they are likely to be related, but we haven't done enough investigation of abruption to be able to answer that question definitively. It's likely they're related, but I can't say definitely at this stage. But perhaps one of the other things that the audience might find interesting is that we're able to study aging in the placenta in a way that we can't study normal aging of adults. And that is because of what one of the questioners already asked about, the rate of aging. The placenta ages in weeks, whereas adults take decades. And it's very hard to study people across decades. So within the laboratory, we're gaining insights into the process of aging in humans that we may be able to apply not only during pregnancy to try and stop the aging of the placenta, but also for adults to slow aging in the future.
So there was a question from one of the attendees who is involved in IVF and asked the question as to, in pregnancies that result from IVF, are there any differences in the rate of placental aging?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't have the answer. We haven't studied IVF pregnancies separately to non-IVF pregnancies. I'm sure with the frequency of IVF pregnancies now, I'm sure, and you can perhaps answer the question, Craig, there will be a significant number of the new 1,000 pregnancies that are the result of IVF. Is it 10, 15%? What's the figure, Craig?
It's about 9%.
9.
Yeah.
And likely to grow.
Yes.
I would think. So we will be able to compare the results and the aging pathways in those IVF pregnancies and non-IVF pregnancies in the future. But I can't answer the question at the moment.
Okay. Well, thank you for the audience for submitting all of those questions. And also, if anyone would like to watch the video again or to share it with other people, then the link for that will be in the chat. And we would encourage you to share this video with friends and family and anyone who's interested in stillbirth. So thank you again, Roger, for your compelling video and for the answers to the questions that the audience have posed.
Sorry, I should add, you probably saw that Lee Dedman was involved in creating the video. She was a PhD student from Natural History Illustration who worked with me to create the animations that you've seen. That was part of her PhD. Okay.
So thank you again. And now I'd like to move forwards and ask Keren to speak. Keren is a grief and loss advocate and is now going to talk to us about grief after loss.
I am going to change tack slightly now and talk to you about tips on how to help families cope after the death of a baby or child. One of the very saddening facts in Australia is that every day 6 babies are born still and 2 die within 28 days of birth. And that equates to more than 3,000 perinatal or neonatal deaths every year. That doesn't include miscarriages and early pregnancy loss. And tonight is very much about acknowledging that the consequences of those losses are very significant for the parents involved. I've got here a quote that says, "The repercussions are immeasurable and life is never the same again. It's vital that families are supported immediately in their grief so they can begin to heal together." And that has come from one of the bereaved parents supported by Red Nose. I'm conscious that there's a lot that I want to talk to you about this evening, and we have limited time. So if I'm going a little fast, please feel free to put questions into the Q&A and we can come back to them. One of the really significant aspects of parental grief is that the grief affects every single aspect of that person's functioning across all domains of functioning. So we'll often hear about parents talking about all of their physical symptoms after loss, things like heart palpitations, indigestion, lack of appetite, sleep disturbances, aches, pains, backache, stomach ache, aching arms, etc. So very real physical symptoms. And at the same time, they're also experiencing some really strong feelings and emotions that are foreign to them, and maybe feelings and emotions that aren't part of their everyday repertoire, leaving them feeling really not grounded and a whole world of overwhelm that is unfamiliar. What also happens is that people's behaviours can change, and they can become preoccupied, they can become restless, tense, irritable, withdrawn, hyperactive, reduced attention span. We'll often hear bereaved parents talking about the fact that they feel like their head's in cotton wool, that they can't process information that they used to be able to process. It. Their behaviour is erratic, that they're either withdrawn or they want to be around people more, just behaviours that again are foreign to them. It's also where we see all of our addictive behaviours come into play, because anything that creates a numbing of the pain becomes far more attractive for parents. We also see people's spiritual view of the world may change. Those who have strong faith may receive comfort from that faith. Others may feel challenged by the fact that their faith has let them down. So really their potential existential view of the world is shattered, as well as impacts socially and professionally. So when people question, why is the grief so intense? Why do I feel so off? Why can't I find a semblance of the person that I used to be? It's because of the fact that grief does impact every single domain of functioning. I wanted to take a moment just to reflect on early pregnancy loss, because what we hear from parents all the time is this minimizing of their miscarriage, their earlier loss, their ectopic pregnancy as, oh, well, at least it happened early, at least you didn't have to give birth, at least. And what I would really love for all of you on the call to be aware of is that often for parents, from the minute they find out they're pregnant, becomes the planning, the hopes, the dreams, the expectations of what life is going to be like with this baby. And that it is a terrible assumption to assume that the grief is associated with the number of weeks of pregnancy or the age of the baby. In reality, what we need to be assessing is what the grief means to that individual parent, regardless of the gestation of their baby or the age of the baby. We know that everyone grieves differently, that it's not a one size fits all, and it doesn't matter whether it's members of the same family, whether it's a friendship group, whether it's a faith-based group, that our role in supporting bereaved families is to get an understanding of what their individualised grief looks like and what supports they need to best help them navigate that grief. Sadly, we hear way too often about the fact that dads and partners often feel like they're left behind. Often dads will talk about the fact that they felt like their role was to support their partner, that they weren't checked in on in the same way that their the mother was, and that they felt that their role was to hold it all together and be that support for their partner. And I want us all to be aware that dads and partners grieve too, and we need to give them permission to grieve at the same time that we're worrying about the physical needs of the mother, the emotional and psychological needs of the mother. And there's a lot of work happening in this space at the moment about how we can really ensure that dads and partners are acknowledged, particularly in the acute hours and days of grief. I'm going to talk to you in a little bit about avoiding traditional views of male and female grief and the belief that men should grieve one way and women should grieve another. And I'm going to spend a couple of minutes in a moment sharing a slide with you that talks to that. We know how important communication is, and so often in grief, that communication breakdown happens. And it doesn't only happen within the family dynamic, it also happens in the broader support network, including those working in the healthcare system and supporting families in other spaces. Often when we don't know what to say, we either don't say anything at all, or we tend to say something that's not overly helpful. So hopefully this evening we can give you some tips on how to communicate better. We also need to bear in mind that there are often children, siblings, grandparents who are part of this grief process, and their needs are also going to be need to be considered. For grandparents in particular, they're often the forgotten grievers, whereas in reality, grandparents experience the double whammy. That is grieving what their children are going through, as well as the loss of their grandchild, and again are often the ones who are expected to be stoic. We have a significant number of the calls coming through to our 24/7 line from grandparents who just want tips, in how to best support their children, but also the space to talk about their own grief. So a little bit of grief theory, and I try not to go overboard with the grief theory, just giving you the bits that will be super helpful in supporting families. So I talked before about being really careful of assuming that men grieve one way and women grieve another. And what I'm going to talk to you about on this slide is what we call the spectrum of intuitive and instrumental grieving. So put really simply, people grieve across a spectrum. At one end, we have our intuitive grievers. Now, historically, they would have been labelled women, a feminine grieving style. And our intuitive grievers are far more social. They're far more comfortable in the discomfort of showing their affect and their emotion. They're very much past and present focused. They want to be able to sit in their grief. They want to talk about their grief, and they are very comfortable with having lots of people around them while they navigate that grief experience. Right up the other end, we have our instrumental grievers, historically a more masculine style of grieving. They are far more solitary. They're far more cognitive in terms of wanting to understand what has gone on and what needs to happen next. They're very much future focused. They tend to be fixers, and they're very productive and active. So our instrumental grievers are often the people who will go on and fund research, who will set up a fun run to raise money. They're also the people who will sue hospitals and who will constantly seek answers to why something went wrong. And then we have our blended style in the middle. Now, it's really important that we remember that this is not a male or female. In today's times, we have just as many men sitting in the intuitive as women sitting in the instrumental. Why is this important for you guys to know? It's because it determines the way that we are going to support parents. If we have got someone sitting up the intuitive end and we start asking them what they think about X, Y, and Z and what they're going to do next, and things that revolve around them thinking through their grief, we're going to alienate them, and they're going to think that we don't care. Alternatively, if we have an instrumental griever who just wants answers and needs to understand what's going on, and we ask them how they're feeling, and, you know, it's okay, we'll come back to your question, but right now I want to know what's going on for you, they're also going to feel like they're not being heard. What's worth noting as well is once we understand our own natural style, it tends to be our go-to in terms of how we support others. So again, that can be really helpful or really unhelpful if it's different to what it's going to, what the family needs. Now, the next slide I want to share with you, and it really ties in with our intuitive instrumental model, is that for healthy grieving to occur, we tend to grieve in two different ways. One, which is called, rephrase. Healthy grieving revolves sitting in these two different spaces and moving between them. So we have on the one hand our loss orientation, and that's very much where we're sitting in the grief, where we kind of do stuff to avoid or deny the change that's happened. While we're in that loss orientation, it's very hard for us to think about the things that we need to do or what needs to happen next. It's quite all-encompassing, that grief space. The other side of this model talks about the restoration orientation, and it's about how we do things to adapt to our life post the death of a baby or child. And it's things like planning a funeral, or letting our workplaces know what's going on and developing a plan for what needs to happen next. It might be navigating Centrelink, etc. And what this model talks about is for healthy grieving, we oscillate between the two. Now, again, why is that helpful for those supporting families? Is that you may be chatting to someone, and within a 15-minute, half an hour, 1 hour chat, you may see that oscillation. You may see them go from, oh my God, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know how I move on from this. I don't know how I'm going to cope with this, to 10 minutes later, talking about all the things that they're going to do next, and they get very productive. Or it might be one time you see them, they're very much in loss, and the next time they're in restoration, or the other way around. And you're kind of going, God, I don't understand what this person's doing. They're all over the shop. What they're doing is the dual process model, and it's a really healthy way to integrate grief. The other model that I like to talk about really briefly is Tonkin's model of grief. And what people tend to think is that grief shrinks over time. And I think any of the bereaved parents on the call today will vehemently disagree with that, and say, well, the grief doesn't shrink over time. What happens is we make space for it. We grow around the grief. So this diagram really kind of shows the fact that the grief isn't, the size of the grief is not changing, but the container is getting larger. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, because so often I think families are set up to believe that their grief will go, that, you know, one day they'll wake up and it won't be there anymore. And I think as those supporting bereaved parents, it's important to know and be able to talk to families about the fact that, you know, their grief will always be there. It won't be as edgy and prickly and painful as it is right now. And it won't always take their breath away and leave them speechless and teary, but it will always be part of who they are, because, as we always say, grief is the price we pay for love. And when we've loved someone and we don't have them anymore, that grief is going to be part of how we continue on without them. I always include this concept and the slide of continuing bonds because, again, historically, when we look back over the generations of how people were expected to get over their grief, it was very much put away all the things that belonged to the person who died, forget everything about them and just get on with it. And I'm really glad to say that that's changed. And in fact, what the research now shows us, that enabling families to develop a way to continue that connection with their baby or child means that the relationship is not severed. That person is no longer part of the family. They will always be part of the family. And it's about helping families find that way to maintain that ongoing connection with their baby. And there are so many ways that families do it. And it can be, as simple as having a space dedicated in memory. So it could in their house with a photo or a candle. We often hear about people who have tattoos or a piece of jewelry or a particular book that they think about in terms of their baby. It might be acknowledging the baby as part of the family at every family event or at Christmas or Easter, etc. So I think, helping families work out what that ongoing connection looks like is really helpful. And I've got here that this doesn't require a belief in the spirit world or an afterlife, but it's acknowledging that precious baby or child will still live on in the memories of the family. So I often joke and say, if I had $1 for every time someone asked me, can't you just write us a script for what we should say and what we should not say to bereaved parents, it would make life so much easier. And, I always like to say that often it's not about what we say or what we don't say, it's about the tone and the intention of what we're trying to say. So often we'll talk about the fact that, I don't know what to say, so I'm not going to say anything. And my tip to all of you is, if you don't know what to say, it's okay to acknowledge that you don't know what to say by saying something like, this is one of those times that I really don't know what to say, but I'm so sorry that you're going through what you've gone through, and I'm here to help you in whatever way I can. Or, this is one of the few times that I find myself speechless, and I just want you to know that I'm here and I care, and, I'm here in whatever way you need me. We often talk about the fact as well of being genuine and authentic. If you are truly genuine and authentic, that intention will come across to the person that you're trying to support. We talk about listening to understand and not to respond. I think because it's so uncomfortable talking about the death of a baby or child, we're so worried about what we're going to say next that's what we're focusing on rather than really listening to what the person has to say. Never be afraid to acknowledge the loss and to call the baby by its name. If the parents have named the baby, there is no greater gift that you can give to those parents than to use that baby's name. The role of culture is so important in supporting bereaved parents and their families. So be curious about culture. Don't be afraid to ask families if there's anything that you should know about their cultural beliefs and any rites or rituals that are important for you to know in that moment. It is always difficult sitting with strong emotions. For any of us, who got into this space because we wanted to make a difference and we wanted to ease suffering, sitting with strong emotions triggers every part of the rescuer in us. And it's important that we sit with them and don't try and fix it, because by doing that, we'll often say things like, you've got no reason to feel guilty. you didn't do anything wrong, or you've got no reason to feel guilty, you're an amazing parent. And what that does is that it shuts down the conversation. It doesn't make the person feel any different. If, however, you respond with, I understand, why, you feel guilty, you would have liked to do anything to be able to keep your baby or child safe, and that hasn't happened. So I understand that feeling of guilt comes from a place of love and protection, something like that. Make sure that your non-verbal communication skills are on. Make sure that you're maintaining eye contact where culturally appropriate. Make sure that your head nodding, that your body language is positive. And I always say, be prepared. We know that these conversations are going to be difficult and it's a hard space, so go into that space with whatever protection you need to put up for yourself so that you can be there for the families. What not to say. Avoid platitudes and one-liners. You're so lucky you're young, you can have another one. You're so lucky that this happened early in your pregnancy and you didn't have to deal with the complications of giving birth. You're so lucky. Your baby's so lucky it didn't have to go through pain. Whatever those one-liners are, don't say them. And what I'll also stress is that I don't think anyone shares those one-liners to be disrespectful. We go to those one-liners when we're uncomfortable and we don't know what to say. So we are saying something that we think is going to help. There's an amazing clip that Brené Brown has shared. It's all over YouTube, that talks about the difference between sympathy and empathy. And she has a great line in there that says, basically, any statement that starts with the words "at least," scrap, because the minute we say "at least," we're minimizing that person's experience. We don't want any of you to assume what the families are going through, no matter how experienced you are, because, as I said earlier, every experience is individual and personal. And I think the one that I actually found the trickiest when I started practicing was trying not to fill the silence. That so often when we families sit in silence, we feel the need to fill it because it's uncomfortable, and yet so much thought processing is happening in those silent moments. So a little tip that I had to use often in my early days was sitting on my hands. So when that silence started, I would sit on my hands and in my head, I'd say, Keren, just shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up. Don't say anything, provide the space. And 9 times out of 10, that the families or the individual will start talking on their own. So your words matter, and what we hear from families over and over and over again is that they remember the beautiful words said to them in the early days of their grief experience. So words like, "I'm sorry this has happened to you." Words like, "Do you have any questions?" or "I'm sorry there isn't a clearer answer to that question," because often the questions will be questions that don't have answers. It's okay to giving parents permission to express how they're feeling. So it's okay to express how you're feeling, and it's normal to be feeling a whole range of things. I started the presentation saying that grief leaves people feeling like aliens, like nothing feels normal. So where we've got the opportunity to normalize their experience, that goes a long way to helping in the grief process. Don't be afraid to use words like beautiful baby, using the name, making sure that you're acknowledging their role as parents and letting them know that support's available to them. Please don't say things like, "It's okay, you can always try again. You're lucky you have other children. These things happen. I understand how you feel," and anything that starts with "at least." Also be guided by by them. How are they talking about their grief experience and what they're going through right now? Because often that's a really good guide into how we should respond to them. So a little bit about our support services for those that don't know what Red Nose offers. We have a 24/7 support line that is manned by people with lived experience across a whole range of losses. We have live chat, we have counselling available nationally, we have support groups nationally, both online and face-to-face. We have a whole range of community events, both face-to-face and online. We have our Treasured Babies program, and for those that aren't aware of that program, that's run by a team of volunteers who knit and crochet beautiful babies' clothing from 14 weeks gestation all the way through to full term. We have on our website information, resources and advice, and we have our hospital to home program. All of that information is available on our rednosegriefandloss.org.au website. And I've got on there the 24/7 support line, which is 1300 308 307. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment to see if there are any questions at all.
Thanks, Keren, for a lovely presentation. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, I'd like to take a comment that Carla made a little further, and she particularly commented on how difficult it was to leave hospital. And I was wondering if you had some advice or recommendations for those of us who work in the clinical space to help families through that really difficult time.
Interestingly, that was actually why the hospital to home program was developed, to really support families as they leave hospital and start that process of integrating back into a world that looks completely different than what it did when they entered the hospital. I think it's really important for families to openly communicate to their support networks about what they need. I think so often we hear from families that they feel that they want to protect those around them, and therefore they hide their grief to some extent. But that trip home from hospital without a baby is probably, one of the hardest aspects of the grief experience. So, what do the parents need to have around them to make that journey easier? And what do the health professionals need to ask those parents before their discharge to set them up for that healthy integration? So, it's things like, what for some parents, they'll be taking their baby with them home for a period of time. So what things do the health professionals need to be aware of to make that as smooth as possible, because they will be carrying a baby home with them? If they're not taking that baby home with them, have the health professionals given the families the information that they need as to what happens next? So again, depending on what the cause of death is for that baby, there may be autopsy and investigations happening. What sort of timelines is that going to involve? What do the parents need to know? How does that impact funerals, etc.? So I think what we heard recently out of some fantastic research that UQ has done for Red Nose that looks at what best practice bereavement support looks like, I should say University of Queensland, is that what parents have found incredibly unhelpful on discharge from hospital is being given a whole lot of paper resources, as opposed to being told what they have access to, or being able to make a warm referral into a support organisation like Red Nose. So where the families can, almost be handheld in that process, that's really helpful as well. I'm hoping that answered the question, Craig.
Yes. So we have a question from online, and not all families want to share their loss at certain times. So what advice would you give to those trying to support families through loss to deal with families who sometimes want to share, other times don't want to share?
I think it's a really good question. And I think, as the health professionals in the hospital, but also anyone supporting families afterwards, it's really important to get an understanding of whether families want to share or they don't want to share. We often hear, and I'm going to say sadly, we often hear from families who have gone through a termination for medical reasons that they don't want to share their loss because of the perceived stigma attached to their loss. So I guess one of the questions that I would be curious about is, what is the reasoning behind people not wanting to share their loss, and whether guilt and or shame are part of that. And then I would be supporting the parents to work through that. But at the end of the day, it is completely the parents' and families' choice as to whether they share their loss or they don't. So if they don't want to share it, I would still be really, curious about, even though you don't want to share it, what sort of support do you need to help you navigate the next stages, understanding that there won't be a broader support network around those families because they're not sharing. What I'll add to that as well is that, so often we hear about the fact that grief is such an incredibly isolating experience for parents. So what we want to make sure is if parents decide not to share their loss, that they're not therefore going through their grief experience isolated. And we would want to be able, if it was something that they wanted, to connect in with community if they need it.
So another question from online: when you're providing care for families after loss, whether it be a week later, months later, a year later, how do you draw the line between normal grief and abnormal grief?
That's a whole webinar on its own, Craig. So what we look at, and we try really hard not to pathologize grief. That grief is an incredibly normal experience to the death of a loved one. And what your question actually is asking is, at what point, should those supporting, bereaved parents or family members be alarmed as to, does this grief still fit into normal grief, or have we stepped into what we call prolonged grief disorder? What's interesting to note is that when we look at prolonged grief disorder, which effectively is grief that isn't healing, so where the bereaved person is struggling to function back into life in a way that is meaningful for them, somewhere between around the 6 to 12 month mark. So still experiencing acute grief that is rendering them unable to function, after a prolonged period of time, that would start to pose the question is, should support look different? So an example will be in the immediate aftermath of a grief. There's a whole lot of avoidant behaviour that parents may show. I don't want to go past the playground that I was going to spend time with my child at, or I don't want to go to the supermarket because I might see people, or I don't want to do this or that. And we kind of, as a therapist, you'd say, you don't have to do anything that you don't want to do right now. It's all about you looking after you and doing the things that you need to do to start that healing process. If we're still having that conversation at 12 months where that avoiding behaviour is actually stopping them integrating back in and functioning, the way we would support families through that would look different. So it really is, and there's, you know, a number of different tests that can be used to kind of get a sense of where people are sitting in their grief experience. Interestingly, that so often we talk about the fact that we don't want to pathologise grief. Often where we have diagnosed prolonged grief disorder, it's actually been a relief to parents that they haven't failed in their grief, that there is something going on for them that's hindering their integration, and they're really open to what that therapeutic model would look like moving forward to help that healing process happen.
Now, pregnancy after loss is incredibly difficult, whether it be a miscarriage, a mid-trimester loss, a termination of pregnancy for medical reasons, a term stillbirth. What resources does Red Nose offer to help families navigate the next pregnancy?
So again, sadly, we hear over and over again how challenging pregnancy after loss is. So from a Red Nose perspective, all of you can access any of our support programs. We will often see families who tapped into our services early on in their loss come back through a subsequent pregnancy. We have subsequent pregnancy or support in subsequent pregnancy groups. We have online groups and face-to-face groups. We have within the hospital to home program the opportunity for families to come back and receive support in their subsequent pregnancies. We acknowledge that sadly the joy and the innocence and the naivety of the previous pregnancy is gone, and what is replaced is a whole lot of fear, anxiety, fear, being scared to believe in that happy ending, because what if it doesn't happen? So, you know, as an organisation, we want to support and normalise all of those feelings and emotions that come with a subsequent pregnancy. So if anyone is going through that, or you know anyone who's going through it who would like to access support, reach out.
And do Red Nose have some unique services for fathers or for partners?
So we actually have our phone line. We have a callback service for any dads that would like to talk to another dad who's experienced the death of a baby or child. We have some dad-specific support groups as well, both face-to-face and online. And we are constantly looking at, we also partner with the SMS for Dads program, which is a series of text messages that are sent out to bereaved dads that are 100% male and father-centric. It is a completely free service. And Lacey, I'm not sure if we can put in the chat, the SMS for Dads information, but if not, we can make sure that we send it out when we send out the recording.
Now, you mentioned on one of your slides about different ways that different cultures handle loss and grief. I was wondering if you'd like to make any comments about grief and loss in our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community.
Yes. And I think for those of you, you know, on the call who are working in the hospital systems, what we hear from First Nations families is firstly how difficult it is for them to be in the hospital system because of their distrust of the system, but also the fact that it doesn't appear that the hospital system is set up to allow for First Nations rights rituals around death. And so what I would love, if you take anything away from this evening, is to really think about how you can make sure that your hospital setting allows for the fact that for First Nations families, family means more than, partners, children, parents, and making space within the hospital to be able to enable families to have room to be able to invite others in, to be aware of things like smoking ceremonies and how important that is, to be aware how important it is often for First Nations families to get back to country. And what does that look like in terms of autopsy and investigations that are happening with their baby and how that baby goes back to country, etc. So I think, again, it's not about having all the answers. It's about being really authentic and curious in the questions that are asked of families so that we can best support them in the way that's right for them. So we've used First Nations families as an example, but it's across all cultures.
Thanks. So another question from the audience. Children often struggle with loss when it happens in their family. So the loss of one of their siblings or a child, a baby that they were expecting to become part of the family. How would you advise families to talk about loss with their children?
So I'll start off by saying that there's some great information on our website around supporting children. My key, I guess, takeaways would be that it will depend on the age of the children, but we really want to avoid, I'm going to use the word airy-fairy explanations of what's happened, because what it does is it creates a fear or a belief. So if you say something like, God came and took the baby to heaven, and the child will probably respond and say, well, is God going to take me too? So really thinking about the language that we use with children, making sure it's age appropriate, being as honest as we can be within their level of understanding, being okay to say to them, I don't know. When they say, why did this happen? I don't know. But when, we're going to get through this together. Also understanding that for children, and particularly young children, routine is what grounds them and keeps them stable. So when that routine is lost, you will see, a whole range of behaviours and emotions that are 100% normal in their grief process, but will feel really foreign. So you might see a regressing in behaviours. You might see bedwetting. You might see thumb sucking. You might see a whole range of behaviours that they've actually gone through a while ago. But you'll also see temper tantrums. You'll see tears for no reason. You might find them being withdrawn. The other thing, though, with children is that they do the dual process model really well. So they can be all over the shop 1 minute and then they're running in the playground, laughing and having fun with their friends the next. It's actually a really good segue, though, to where I did want to finish today. So I'm going to share my screen one more time for a second and talk to you all just really briefly. We are very close to launching a bereavement support e-learning program, which will cover lots of the questions that have been asked today. It's been developed in a way that uses parent voice throughout. It connects a grief theory with the experience of loss of families who are sharing their stories as part of the e-learning. It will give very practical strategies to support families through their grieving journey. It goes into detail about things like supporting children across the ages, the developmental ages of the children. That's a bit of what it will look like. It is very interactive. There's beautiful graphics. It also has a self-care kit included. And what all of us know working in this space is that self-care is so incredibly important. The rates of burnout are high, and so a big part of this e-learning program is with that focus of self-care throughout the e-learning. So that will be launching very soon, so stay tuned. And that finishes the presentation with 3 minutes to go. Craig?
Excellent time management. So I'd like to wind things up now. I particularly would like to thank Carla for sharing her story about Apollo. And I think many of the comments that you made about your journey will stick with me as someone who looks after families through this. And certainly many of the comments that you've said, Keren, tonight will also change the way I interact with families. And I believe that everyone who's had the opportunity to listen tonight has gained something from the evening. And Roger, thank you for your very clear summary, looking at all of the questions that were happening in the background. We appreciate you answering all of those and the research that you and your team are doing in this important area. So thank you everyone for attending tonight. We'll be sharing the link for the recording in coming days. Please sign up to the Red Nose socials and the newsletter to keep up to date about the next research and education session, which is scheduled for 6:30 on Tuesday, the 9th of July. So thank you everyone for dialing in tonight, and I hope you've all learned something from the experience.